Well, hello again. This is Philip at thebest3d.com, and we're going to continue our exploration of muzzle flares and explosive bursts of fire and smoke and that sort of things that you see perhaps at the barrel opening of a cannon or a gun or the back exhaust from a VW bug from the 60s when you shift back in reverse. Something like that, right? So I'm doing just this last final stage here of a little animation. In fact, I've enabled, I'm doing the motion prediction module here, and I've enabled showing the motion vectors as they are, as the system is calculating how to best interpolate between the two frames at a time to produce an even smoother animation. So that just as a little side note, you can hide that. And I'm going to do this final render perhaps with a little bit less search distance, so it's done a little bit faster, a little bit coarser, and doesn't have to be that high a quality just to understand how it works. I mean, obviously, if you need the absolute best, you'll want to fiddle with these parameters a little bit. Okay, so let's see what we got here. We have an animation that is fairly complex now. There's a lot of things happening here. And you could imagine this coming out, let's say if you turn the engine on a spaceship, right? Push the button and boom, it has this big cloud of clogged hydrogen coming out, an initial burst. You might want to even add a little bit of a lens flare or stars or something extra bright. But what is this motion, this initial movement made of? How did I get to that? There's a couple of things I did to get to that point. So I'm going to show you some of the stages. And the one just before this one, I had this stored animation here, which shows a bit of a turbulent displacement. So evidently I must have done some sort of a displace one animation against another, right? And you can see here there's still this one here that I stored still has a checkbox here on use the animated as swap. So then I used, after I've done that, selected it as the swap image, I can use a displace by swap, and one image frame for frame from one animation will displace the other. So we'll go through that as well. Here's another stage a little bit earlier. I was experimenting with combining two, and you can do that still. Even here, if I click on this big preview icon, you can do different types of combining, right? You can do show me greater than, and then as you navigate, you see if there are pixels that are greater value in the swap, it will show that. If you have maybe Phoenix is an interesting mode, or not so much. There are a lot of modes here to try. Exclusion, so sometimes you'll get some really interesting coloration effects with that maintain the vivid light might be an interesting one. That's, I think, one I did use also. All right, let's uncheck this. Another thing you'll see, there's a little bit of a ghosting on that animation, so evidently I did a little bit of a ghost trail. Let me load this one just so we can see what that one had. Yep, that one is probably one where I did the ghosting, so you can see there is sort of the intense cloud, and then there's a little fading trail of 10 or so prior images fading away. And then before that, I had this one here with not really a whole lot. And so that's really the one I wanted to start with. Actually, this one here, before I recolorized it. This one is done with the particle modeler. Now, you don't have that in PD Artist, so you do need, and besides this animation altogether, you don't have that in PD Artist. So you do need PD Howler. As seen on Steam, 9.6 is what I'm using. Actually, I'm using Howler 10 here, sort of an early version. It's still probably about 2 or 3 months, maybe 4 months away from release. We're just starting to rewrite things and make some changes. So you may see some similarity with 9.6, but you'll also see some differences. Just ignore them for now. What I'll do is I'll start from scratch. So I'm going to create here a new let's see, Let's do something like relatively small initially, 640 by 512. Let me use the Control Shift and pan this around a little bit. I suppose we could probably move these out of sight here or even minimize them. So what I'd like to do is create an animation with this frame, initial sequence there, let's say 123 frames. And then I'm going to go to this animated particle modeler, right? I also call it the cloud modeler. It's kind of a volumetric appearing, but particle based. And so the particle modeler, we have quite a bunch of tutorials on that. What I'd like to do is really start with something simple and then focus on what sort of animation controls you have on it to make it look like an interesting moving cloud. That could be a puff cloud coming out of the barrel when you shoot a gun. So what I'll do is simply add a sphere or do a little airbrush. Let's add a sphere and we can place it here. Perhaps we'll do two spheres. We'll do one that's a little bit bigger and a little bit less density actually. So let's do that again. Let's do new. Let's say density minimum, density maximum. So let's keep it at a relatively low density here. Let's keep it 1, or it could be 0.1, 0.1. There you go. So we have, how come I got a negative here? 0.1. There you go. So we have a minimum size and a maximum size. That's for the individual particles. I'm going to go 99, so relatively large particles, but they're not very dense, and the minimum size of 33 or 44, and then we'll create a sphere. And that sphere we may want to make even bigger. Let's go with the scale here and adjust the size a little bit. In fact, you could also make it a little bit more of a flat, like oval, like this, and then add another sphere. But before we do that, we set the density a little bit higher. So this one will be a 0.5 minimum density and up to 0.3 for the maximum density. The size minimum will be a little bit smaller now. So we'll go from 1.1 to 3.3, something like that. And then add a sphere like this. So this sphere we will need to perhaps make a little bit more elongated like this. And never mind this preview, that's just the prior one. This current one is not done yet. We can move it around a little bit. We can move it like so. Keep it in the center to the other. Perhaps flatten it a little bit. Scale. And that's really, if you have a shape like this, you might as well just use the airbrush. That's another way to just brush it across that path. Let's see, one more little adjustment here. All right, so we got two together. Let's go preview that. Ready for preview. So clearly we have a very fluffy, bigger, more transparent cloud here, and then we have a kind of a smoke, loaded with smoke, and we can give this even more dramatic look with the lights. You can adjust the position of the lights, and even during animation later on when we go to animate here in the tab, we can animate those lights as well, but most importantly we can also adjust their intensity. So perhaps we want something a bit more loaded with smoke or a little bit more dark looking, and so there is some self-shading. Do that for each of the lights, and then also the cloud itself has some controls, and just kind of find the way you see, maybe there's this cloud of vaporized water in the air from the blast. So there's a bunch of different techniques here to explore for slightly different appearance. And let's say we want to use this one. All right, so now let's go. Well, you certainly will want to save that if it's a good one to keep again for future use. Let's go and animate. And when you animate this, one thing you'll want to do is do a movement that goes from left to right, but perhaps also a little bit of a rotation. So I'm going to go from about here. In fact, let me adjust the position of this so you can see at the bottom the scroll bar. I still have a prior animation I did earlier, so I'm going to go clear that. Let's make sure we clear the keys in the lower right here, clear the keyframes, and then go to the very first. and make sure you rotate. And what you're rotating is not the sunlight or the camera, but what you want to rotate is the object. You'll see soon what you want to do is really create movement on the object itself, not the camera looking at it, but the object, because that's going to be crucial when we activate the secondary motion here on the left. So let's go and move this thing over here to the left, right? And click the plus sign to add a keyframe, and then we'll go about 1/3 into the animation, more or less. Let's go, still moving the cloud, right? Edit the cloud, and this one here is move. So now we'll move it to the right and give it a good yank, something like almost into the second half of this frame, and position that, and then we'll have a little bit of a rotation as it's staying there, or just moving a little bit more but rotating. And now we need to find the right, so I think it's, yeah, going up. What you want to do is kind of do a little twist, but still line this thing up here. It's just an idea, just a suggestion. Try to give it a full twist with that, right? And something like that. And then, just leave it be. You can do another keyframe here with no change. So now what you see is that it's moving like this. You can also switch temporarily to render preview off. You can turn the grid off, and then see basically what this cloud pattern will do. So now, right now, it's kind of a solid, rigid body rotating, all things connected. Now, what we'll do is we'll add secondary motion. And when we add that, everything doesn't move at the same time. The inner parts are being pulled with a slingshot style elastic band, and then the rest is following. And same thing with that rotation. It's not getting that rotation done right away. But we do have the last 30 or so frames available to wait for it to settle down, and that's why we did that. We didn't go all the way to the very end. We stopped at about the last third with the last keyframe of significant positional or rotational change. Things you can also do here is make things a little bit faster. The laziness, if you put that down to 3, it will not be so lazy. Whereas if you put it to, let's say, 15, it will be lazy, and it will take longer for everything to follow. Right? So you can make a little bit more of a elastic looking dynamic there. And so here's the preview, and you can see there's a nice little smoking trail. So imagine this attached to maybe a rocket exhaust, and this is the bright smoke, but then there is some small puffy things that are remaining. That's kind of where this is going to be heading. We could do a few other things. We can add some displacement. That one's pretty neat too. If you look at a lot of noise, the displacement will make those things be very noisy, but the displacement amount in particular can have it go all over the place, right? So this thing is very noisy now. What's really cool, I think, is less of a noise but more of the displacement. So then you have a bit of a turbulent scenario without too much noise. And then you also have just alive towards the end here. If you wanted to just keep moving on its own, the particles are just breathing, just moving, just dancing around a little bit, showing some sign of life. Okay, I'm gonna go and render that now, and that will take a few seconds. Granted, we could have done more. We could have keyframe changes in the light source. Maybe the light source should actually move with the object to kind of indicate inner lighting. So all sorts of other things you could do with that. You can also render that twice, right? You can render it again, and since there is some randomness to it, it will be not just a duplicate render on itself. It will add a little bit more pizzazz, and it will be perhaps really something worth trying again. So try this, and we have sort of a starting point of a puff cloud coming out of the barrel. I'm going to go now close this and look at my animation. It's not always perfect, but it's usable enough to do something with. All right, so one of the first things we'll want to do is, let's see, yeah, store it, right? Store it and save it. I mean, you really want to store to disk at least, so that if the program were to die, battery out of power, crash, bug, whatever it is, or the cat runs over the keyboard and hits the off button, right? It has happened. We want to store it on disk, so that's the one place, and then we can get back to the temp folder where that thing has been stored and retrieve it with the open command. It's a DWA dog waffle animation file format. Another thing, if you're happy with it, also go and save it to AVI, preferably still in a Lagarith or some other uncompressed format. But okay, so we'll skip that for just today, and what we'll do is we'll add a few things. So we have not stored it. Did we store it? Oh yeah, there it is. So we have stored it, and now what we'd like to do, in fact, let me close these. We don't need these anymore. All right, so one of the first things I also did is add a little bit more space around it, right? Swapping memory here a little bit. taking time. There you go. All right, so you see it's kind of on the edge here, and it probably, if I do some blurring, it's probably going to hit the edge, a wraparound or something like that. So it's probably a good idea to add some space, and you can do that with image size. Add some black color around it. So I'm going to go and say width-wise, we're going to go to pretty wide. Height, we can leave it as is. We're going to go mostly in this horizontal direction. So here we go, resample it, and now we still see the edge of this initial part here, but that will soon disappear, and we have a good amount of space to work with. All right, so one thing we'll do is actually we'll store this one, right? This is really our working session here, store that to disk, which means this one here we probably can minimize and get it out of the way. Okay, so we have this. Let's add a couple of things. Let's do a smoke trail here, or a ghosting trail. So let's go to the timeline and filter all the way down to the bottom, scroll to ghost. All right, now if you just do the default, it's 4 levels of ghosting. Fine, let's do that. It's pretty fast. You can see the rendering is actually running backwards. That's a cute little side note. It's rendering from the last frame to the first. It's one of the few filters that does that. But now you do see a little bit of ghosting, and especially here in this area, you can see that it's got a little bit of a displacement or a ghosting trail to that. If you wanted even more of that, let's do an undo. See what it looked like before. There it is, very crisp. And now this time I'm going to go all the way to 16 and apply that. So that's going to leave much longer trails, and that may be just perfect for what we need. Another thing though that we probably also will want to do once this is done is perhaps add a little bit of a horizontal blur. That's essentially a zoom blur or a motion blur, right? The zoom blur may be really the one we want here. So let's experiment with that a little bit. So we have a motion trail here that we can see. Let's see it perhaps zooming back out. There you go. Okay, and what you can see is this could be the initial exhaust of the plume out of the barrel on your gunshot, right? And then essentially, as it's doing this, you will want to fade it away. So we will at some point also use this adjust filter where we have the value go back to 0, right? So as you do that, you'll see it fade away, right? But over time, so we don't want that on all frames. We just want that on the last 20 frames or something like that. All right. So, but that's for a little bit later. One thing I want to do is add a little bit more movement there. So I'm going to store this. Of course, that's part of our daily workflow or minute workflow. We need to store these every once in a while, and to make sure we have a safe snapshot of that. And so the other type of things we could do here is a blur in the sense of a zoom blur or of a motion blur. Right, so let's take a look at the motion blur. That one, if you have a lot of it, the length here, you see that here in this preview, it's going to be an interesting movement. You can set the angle to blur it more up and down, and that could be part of the shockwave initially, and then it elongates again. I mean, you could animate that with a couple of keyframes to not have just a single orientation. So here's a quick test. Let's see what it looks like once it's done, just to see if that's the type of blur we like, right? And why not? Look at that. Okay, it's getting to look very mystic now, kind of a ghost movement. So let's go and store that one. Store to disk, that's a candidate. Let's take a look at another one. And so I'm going to go and undo. And this time I'm going to use a similar one. It's the zoom blur, or even better, the mystic vision. And this one has the advantage that you can also change the position of where the hotspot is, and you can make it keyframe, so you trace it. You follow the movement of the center of the blast here. So go to the first frame, and it will be somewhere around. Actually, what we'll do is we'll have it all the way at the beginning here, and we'll say 0 factor, so you don't really see anything yet. And then very shortly after that, we have the big blast initialization. So we'll have a big strong factor, and you see a bit of a perhaps we need to increase the quality, and you could even have it come out further. So there's a really strong, it's very faint here in the preview, but you'll see more of it even as soon as we render that. So we go here. See now how we have a very long, almost just the light. It's not so much the particles, it's really just the light going this way. And so that's one thing you can do with it. You can have it blast out this way, and then factor something like that, and then short and maybe a little bit faster to get to that point also. So grab these control points here, and then here we'll need to kind of catch up. So we'll move this into the center of this cloud and reduce the factor, keep the quality high, all right, but bring it in there and keyframe that, and keep tracking, and then perhaps shortly to that here we could be at this level here. Okay, so we have now a sequence of positions for this blast, and as we render that, we'll see what it looks like here. There it is. You notice how we initially lash out here, right? Boom, it comes out really strong, and then the cloud really starts to move. So that's another interesting one, and then we could also add the lens flare without the lens reflections. Let's go to lens flare right there. Let's go show the flare settings, and you could do, for instance, something like this one, or you could do some of the others like these guys, and those would be really good to show trailing or following the the blast zone here, something like this. So you start around here, but keep it 0 level, right? And then you go, and that will be right here at the very beginning, first frame. And then shortly after that, you are still around here, but you are coming up with a big bright flash, and keyframe that. And then here it starts to move, and the bright flash is not quite that bright anymore, but still there. And then you move down to about this place, and there's still a lot of burning and haze and light happening here. And then towards the end here, it just dies away. All right, so you could do something like this, and in fact really just blend it away. All right, so we have a little bit of a animated flare that's not now going along with this smoke. And let's see what that looks like. Okay, all right, still a little bit slow motion, right? I mean, this is probably more frames than what we really need. All right, so let's go store this one, store animation, but realize that maybe we are not quite done yet with the clouds. There's also more turbulent displacement we'd like to experiment with. So I'm gonna go and undo this, or I'm gonna go and, I don't know which one was the most recent stored copy, maybe this one here, probably not. Let's do this one. And what we can do is look at something else which is really more displacement. So I'm going to go and use an earlier one here as an animated swap. All right, I think this one here would do just fine. Yep. And so I'm going to load this one. And as I'm using the two, I really want to not combine them, although that's another thing you can also do here. Click this to enable the layer mixing between the main and the swap image, and then decide how you want to bring the two together, like a color dodge or a soft light, Phoenix, the dissolve. Some of these will create some really interesting effects and highlights and stuff like that. So one thing we'll do is we'll look at one of them and then use the other one, like this one here, as a displacement and as a swap image, that is. And then so the two frames, two animations are going side by side in parallel, and we can use one to displace the other. We can do this in a continuous mode and just simply say, for instance, do a color twirl displace, and as you do that, you'll see some coloration, you'll see some interesting turbulence appearing. We can always remap that to a different gradient later on. If you want to keep it grayscale or a particular coloring, that's fine. But the beauty of this is if we animate this, it will apply this kind of distortion calculation frame for frame, and it will probably create some interesting patterns that we could also see using for something like disruptions in water, refraction mapping, perhaps something like smokes, smoke puffs, or something, like a plume from an explosion on at the top of a volcano. If you rotate it, right, if you turn it up 90 degrees. So lots of different ways to actually use this technique. And one of them is to say, okay, I like what it did to highlight some of these turbulent details, but now let's remap it to a different color. And so for that, what we can do is use the sweep editor here under the view menu. The sweep editor is one of the gradient tools, perhaps my favorite. And in fact, if you don't want to use one of the presets, this one is a good preset, right? Anything that's dark will remain dark. It goes from left to right. Anything that's black will remain black, but then it soon becomes kind of a reddish. And what's really bright, the white spots, will remain white. Right, now, if you wanted to change them to a different color, you can do that right here. You could say, let's work on the green and reduce the green a little bit. So I had a little bit more of a purplish resulting color, because there's still some decent amount of blue. And if you also want to get rid of that or get rid of the red a little bit, it will have more of a bluish, very bright blue at this point, right? So here you go. You could do something like that. And so now as you remap it, you can go to color and map to the current gradient. See, there it is. So now it's going to do that over the entire frame sequence. So if that's the color you like, that's one technique to use. Now, maybe you have a different gradient in mind. Maybe you see something here and say, oh, I'd like to use exactly this collection of images here, these colors, right? A portion of that. So you can just grab it from there. You can do the filter, excuse me, that's right here, this tool where the gradients are and the lens flares, and right click on that, and there is a gradient grabber, the linear gradient grabber tool. And so what you do is you click and drag and you select what part of the gradient you want to, what part of the image you want to turn into a gradient. Boom, and there it is. So let's say we go from black to white, but maybe this white, and we encounter a bunch of different colors in between. See? Okay, now we can also just move it. Let's go do that. We can also reverse it if you want to actually turn it into a negative, or the other way, not negative really, but what's dark turns bright and what's bright is dark. Let's go do that and apply color map to current gradient. There you go. And then now do that over the entire sequence. So now we have something that has fewer colors that we picked up. You can always move that, smooth that for even more colors again. But it's an interesting technique to just experiment with a drastically different color mapping or remapping and resulting effects from that. And then you might want to use that once again with, let's say this one perhaps, or this one. Let's click that one to become our current animated. Enable them to view them both together in, I don't know, greater than maybe. And then so you see a combination of the smoke here, of the smoke trail. This is where you have about 20 different technique blending modes, and some of them will just produce some really interesting ones. dissolve Phoenix. Let's see what Phoenix does here. Ooh, look at that, kind of a jellyfish looking glow to it. That's definitely one I would want to keep. So let's go and enable that merge with swap and do that on each frame, because you may want to do a little animated brush with a jellyfish, right, at some point for your underwater scenes. So when you encounter something like this and you say, well, this would be really cool for a totally different project too, don't hesitate to save it and to put it aside for future use. So we'll do one last one here. I think we'll need to combine with this one here this time. So I'm going to go, this time I'll do a different type of combine. I'm going to do something, let's see, screen. Screen is decent, but not perfect. We have a round gray. Ooh, I like that. It's kind of a glowy look to that. Let's do that. Right click, set merge with swap, and there you go. And so now we have this part, and we could do the whole thing all over again. We could do some more blurring, we could do some more the opposite of blurring. Let's do a little bit of bokeh blur and bokeh blur, a lot of bokeh blur, there it is. And once we have that, we could do a little bit of contrast enhancement. In fact, one of my favorite contrast enhancements is the one we get by adding some lighting on top of it. Suddenly it comes to life in 3D. So we have this one here. Let's go and be rigorous and religious about it and store this one. And then once we have it, there it is, we can do a little bit of contrast. Let's see, convolve, edge, color Sobel edge. So many different things. Look at that. You can see on the inside now kind of an X-ray view of the inner layers almost, though they are really the outer ones. But anyway, so that's one thing. Oh wait, I had this one frame there. Let's undo that. And let's do one more, which is the lighting. So we go to the stylize filter and lighting tool. There's glowing edges too, by the way. That one also can be very interesting to add a little bit of a glow effect to it while enhancing a bit of the contrast. So it does sort of an edge detection and glows them. And at least it looks like something like that. And then there's a couple of other stylize, like a plastic wrap that could also be interesting. That adds a little bit of a plastic or depth, almost like a shadow drop, shadow cast, or embossed look to it. And if that's it, then we'll store that one. I'll skip it. I'll just go to the next one. In fact, let me reload this one here from 2-3 sequences earlier. And what I'd like to do is just one more, which is with the lighting. So I'm going to go to stylize lighting tool, and you see how this also reveals some really interesting details, especially if you increase this, multiply with the original smoothness, get rid of some of the detail. Right? Maybe you only want the big picture there, and then you can also have the light much brighter, farther away, add some gloss to it, all sorts of very different appearance you can get from that. I'm gonna go with a little bit more darkness on that, and a little bit less. Now what is it? Something like that. Really not a whole lot of effect it has there, but it could be useful for some renderings. There you go. So I'm going to animate just that. And hopefully that'll give you some ideas of other types of things you can try to create a very turbulent looking puff of cloud coming out of the gun barrel or the cannon, or once again out of a VW bug that's just turning the ignition, or that's actually driving on 4th gear and then shifting down to 3rd gear. Back in the 60s, and actually forever, I think, that was an interesting side effect that you could see a little puff cloud coming out. And I'll leave that with you for further exploration at this point, and thanks for watching. There's a lot to explore, a lot more to try as well, and we'll talk to you soon.